Thank you, Maria, for this wonderfully rich lecture and for the attempt to position the discourse and for the attempt to situate the discourse on concepts with which we are working in time and place, as you said. To a certain extent, I wonder how Manuela is going to escape from the positionality which she has been assigned in this lecture. Just to introduce her very briefly, she has been she's a sociologist, received her PhD from the University of Eichstätt, became professor of sociology first in Berlin and since 2015 in Freiburg. Has published broadly on various aspects of our topic. I just mentioned an edited volume on decolonizing sociology that came out in 2010, a book on global inequalities beyond Occidentalism, 2015, and most recently the award-winning book, which has already been mentioned, which she wrote together with literary scholar Anca Pavulescu, Creolizing the Modern Transylvania Across Empires. And I should also mention that Manuela has been member of the advisory board of the Imre Kertész Kolleg from 2016 to 22. So thank you for being here. She will now respond, maybe 10, 15 minutes, you said? If that's enough. Then we will have a short discussion here on the panel, and then we'll open the floor and use the time until 11, until the coffee break, for a more general discussion. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joachim, for the kind invitation. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to respond to Maria Todorova's very rich paper. Can you hear me well? Okay. I had the paper beforehand, and it's longer than what we heard. I will limit my comments to what we heard here. But just to say, reading it beforehand and listening to it here, it felt for me like reading a detective novel, which is seldom for an academic text. I was really curious to get to the end and see who did it, because it was really about who is the perpetrator of this inflation of terminology that we are all facing, and how can we deal with it. I do think that this is one of the most generous approaches to a contradictory question, and one that is extremely erudite and takes into account all of the literature rather than what usually happens in controversies, cherry picking the selective arguments that would use your own take better. And this is not what Maria Todorova does, nor have I known her to be engaging in such selective controversy. But this text, I thought, is particularly rich and particularly generous in addressing one of the maybe most heated conceptual debates, because I think this is what we're looking at. We're not looking at different paradigms that are irreconcilable. We're not looking at texts that kind of try to give completely divergent interpretations of reality. In a way, it has also been mentioned in Maria's talk. It is also an intergenerational divide, and it's a particular choice, which comes with terminological consequences, but also with political consequences. Now, part of that is also a disciplinary divide, but I don't see that, or let me put it like that, I see that particular divide as the least problematic of all. And so the division between the not quite historians and kind of the proper historians was maybe the starkest critique that I found in the text. I don't want to take up too much time because you don't want to listen to me as much as engage with the arguments of this entire question. I will try to at least divide what I'm going to say in two parts. One is minor comments to individual points, and the other is the bigger question of what it is that we're dealing with here, what is the critique and the actual solution, if there is a solution to the critique of the overuse of decolonization. And I'll start with the minor points that I think have to do with the choice of terms that are being addressed here. We've heard several lists with post-colonial, post-coloniality, neo-colonial, quasi-colonial, decolonial, decoloniality. I think it's important here to differentiate the levels at which they are being used, because they are sometimes employed metaphorically, and that definitely applies to decolonization as a whole. But most of these terms are employed either for a historical analysis or for a conceptual delimitation, or in order to refer to a specific moment in time, as with post-colonial. And there was a huge debate about when the post-colonial was and whether or not it's a chronological term, and there are divergent opinions on that. But I think what we cannot do is to place them on the same level as if they are part of the same terminological inflation, just because they have the same root word with colonial in it. And I will get to some of the particulars in a minute. With some of the critique that has to do with the definitions of colonialism that we heard about in the talk, Eva Thompson's definition, for instance, and the definition of the military colonialism as the military conquest of a certain nation, prompted Maria to say, well, then that means you have first to have nations in order to have colonialism. I think here, the same terminological precision that Maria pleads for is warranted here, because a nation is not a nation state. Not having to have a nation state before you have colonialism doesn't mean you do not have a nation. We have First Nations, we have groups identifying as nations that never became nation states. And here I have to think of one of the examples that Emanuel Wallerstein provided in Germany in 1984 when he was invited to speak at the German Sociological Congress in, I think, Düsseldorf it was, where the topic was societal development. And he said, well, what is it that is developing? What is society? Is society a nation state? Is Germany a nation state in 1984? Apparently, we have a nation with two states. And if we go further back in history, at some point, there was a nation with three states. So Germany does not conform to this definition of a nation state. And at the other end of the scale, he said, and that was kind of not, I don't think the sociologists saw it coming. At the other end of the scale, we have a nation that never became a state, for instance, Puerto Rico, that is part of the United States and would certainly define itself as a nation, but throughout its history has only been colonized and has not been a state. So I think here, saying you first have to have nations in order to have colonialism is correct, but it's not a reason to reject this understanding of having nations and then having colonialism, because we're not talking about nation states. And maybe we can get into whether or not I got this right, and maybe you meant something else. So with the terminological distinction here, I think what you're addressing mostly is the overuse of decolonization. And really, somebody at some point tweeted like, well, next we have to decolonize our shoes because everything needs to be decolonized now. And this is, I guess, what you're getting at. And you never put it that bluntly or kind of respectlessly as that tweet, but what you mean is an inflation of the word. Now, does that mean that that covers the use of coloniality? And I think the entire discussion that you present on the definition of colonialism and colonization, as well as decolonization, is absolutely correct and very instructive to have working definitions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that coloniality does the same work. And it is important, and the reason why somebody like Quijano, who was a sociologist, introduced the word coloniality, was not at all invested in doling out colonial to every state and say, well, here's an empire, you've never been called colonial before, but now I allow you to be so. And those who write in the tradition of Quijano are also not invested in naming everything colonial. They are interested in the purchase of the concept of coloniality that goes beyond the reality of colonialism and means that what colonialism left in place were racial hierarchies, economic hierarchies, social hierarchies, cultural hierarchies that are still there, and that did not just impact the societies that had been formally colonized, but became a framework, and Marx would have called it superstructure, Wallerstein calls it geoculture, and Quijano calls it coloniality because it's more than just culture. It has economic, social, cultural, and epistemic impact, not only on those societies that were colonized, and that happens long after administrative, formal decolonization. And I think this is also the purchase of the term coloniality for the young cohort of scholars that you address. They are not, at least not all of them, interested in using it metaphorically and not being specific enough because they're not historians or they're not afraid of ahistoricity. I think a lot of them, precisely because they build on Quijano, and Quijano's own genealogy comes from dependency theory, then through world systems analysis, then to decoloniality. The interest of these young scholars, not so young anymore either, is that a lot of the structures in societies that were not colonized have been impacted by coloniality as a structure, which doesn't mean that their own societies can now be called colonial too. But it does mean that the decolonial is a project that has nothing to do with formal decolonization. So decolonizing a curriculum does not mean having had a colonial curriculum in the first place, but that coloniality has permeated structures of knowledge, university structures, ways of thinking, disciplinary canons that are very much impacted by the hegemony of successive hegemons, to be clear, of the capitalist world system. And most of these hegemons, or actually all of these hegemons, have been Western hegemons. Now, what does that mean for the East of Europe? Because this is the question here. Is that actually enough to explain what is happening in the East of Europe? And is it even more than just importing a concept and just applying it wholesale to a region in which it has never been actually seen, or you put it as it's a neologism. And you say the perception is a neologism. Did you mean to say that the perception is a neologism? Because that's what's written, but I can't make sense of the sentence as it is, because the perception, of course, is the subjective experience. And the neologism is colonialism or neocolonialism. But is it something new? Because I get that this is what you're saying. It's a new way of putting one's own historical experience into words. Now, would you say that when Kwame Nkrumah coined neocolonialism, he was referring to a social reality with a neologism that shouldn't have applied? Was he saying that Ghana was not actually colonized and it was only now that it's being colonized? Probably not. And I think that form of understanding of how something that is formally not there, colonial rule was not there in Ghana at the time, is still there in the form of racial, economic, cultural, epistemic hierarchies. So for me, and when my students ask me, well, is neocolonialism the same thing as coloniality? I say, no, but it has been used to mean that. And I think Nkrumah's neocolonialism was an attempt to articulate the persistence of colonial hierarchies in post-independence times, which later Quijano addresses as coloniality. When you say that subjectivity matters, but none of the contemporaries in the Balkans under Ottoman rule felt they were in a colonial positionality, it's, of course, hard to disprove it unless with precise quotes. And I didn't have quotes of intellectuals under the Ottoman rule directly at hand when I read the paper, but I do want to bring one quote by Constantin Dobrogea from 1908, Marxist economist and historian in Romania, who describes the way capitalism encroaches upon Romania in the following words. I quote, "Backward countries enter the orbit of advanced capitalist ones. They move within the orbit of those countries, and their whole life, development, and social movement are determined by the historical epoch in which we are living, by the bourgeois capitalist epoch. And this determination of the life and social movement of backward countries by the advanced ones is their very condition of life." He doesn't say colonial. He doesn't say colonialism. What is it that he's describing is something for us to grasp. I think the use of coloniality in order to address what Guerra and many others were saying at the time, not only in Romania, but throughout actually the semi-periphery in Eastern Europe and later also in Asia, is something that can very much be grasped with the coloniality, but it wasn't there yet. Now, is the neologism the problem, or is the fact that the language for that perception was not there yet? I'm coming to an end to just give some more time for discussion. Let me go back to the document. Now, I completely agree with you when you say coloniality and inter-imperiality are working together, and so we need both. For me, this is the solution to, or also the answer to your question, can we speak of a Latin American centrism with the search for a first modernity? And my exact answer to that question would be in German, Jein. Yes and no. I don't think that the insistence of Latin American decolonial scholars on the fact that the Iberian colonization was the first modernity is a search for precedents. Latin American decolonial thought comes from dependency theory. It was steeped in a critique of political economy, and what they're looking for is an understanding of how primitive accumulation worked, and saying it's not with British colonialism that primitive accumulation had started. Without Iberian colonization, there would be no resources. I mean, the Williams thesis, basically. There would be no resources to even start industrialization. Do not forget that this was the modern capitalist system as well. So what is happening with an insistence between, or differentiating between first and second modernity, is to say we capture terminologically and historically, but also epistemically, a shift in hegemony. With the shift in hegemony from Spain and Portugal to the Netherlands and then France and Britain, there is a shift towards also a different kind of dominant language in the world system, forgetting both the theoretical production and the economic contribution of Spain and Portugal, or the Iberian colonizers, to modernity as capitalist accumulation. And I think this is a legitimate and important focus that has enriched a lot of the literature on our understanding of how capitalism began in the 16th century. But at the same time, I agree with you here that it is a way of Latin American centrism, in that the Atlantic focus has led to an understanding that coloniality started with the Western European colonial expansion, and that kind of explains it all, and explains it all for Eastern Europe as well. So once we have coloniality, we look at what's happening in terms of cultural, racial, economic hierarchies in Eastern Europe, and let's say after the 18th century, it's all because of coloniality too. This is where I think the term inter-imperiality comes in handy, and this is the kind of blind spot of Latin American decolonial theorists for me. They've looked west all the time, and they've kind of globalized coloniality to apply to the rest of the world. Now, I think without an understanding of how empires, the so-called pre-modern empires were still very much there in the east of Europe and in Central Asia, and actually throughout the East, well into the 20th century, tells us that structures that were impacting hierarchies of all sorts, but social and racial as well, would not have been there or would not have kind of been transformed through coloniality and been wiped out completely. So coloniality does not erase whatever is out there, it incorporates it. And it incorporates things like the racialization of Roma slaves in an institution that preceded capitalism in Romania, for instance. So it's not a racial institution when it comes up, but it becomes a racialized understanding and a commodified understanding of enslavement by the 18th century. I'm going to leave it at that because I've spoken for too long already, but I hope there's some food for thought in there and to start a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this lucid critique. Manuela challenged you on several issues and posed some direct questions. So would you like to respond directly?
Okay, thank you. Manuela, thank you. First, the easy question. Eva Thompson. I had to agree with her on something. I mean, what she said was she introduced the chronological principle, and that to me was a light in the usual tirade that she used. I never meant to say that that comes with nation. So I agree with everything you say about nation and nation states there. So that's absolutely the easy question. Now. You're right, it is about terminological inflation. You are right that coloniality is beyond the reality of colonialism, but you are using the word beyond the reality of colonialism. And Kwame Nkrumah was beyond the reality of colonialism, just like post-colonialism in India was the hegemony of colonialism after the reality and the experience of colonialism. So I think that, you know, the nebulous thing that we are all now in the world of hegemonic coloniality, and this affects also Eastern Europe, makes it again a universal metaphor which is useless. What we have, I agree, is imperiality, and imperiality also impacts the post-imperial entities with a persistence of different racial and social and economic and cultural residues. I call that legacy, which is a very, very neutral word. It is not a word which stems from a particular historical experience which coloniality presupposes. Now, the issue of neologism or non-neologism, let me give you an example. In the Ottoman Empire, all the nationalists were speaking about Ottoman slavery, Turkish slavery. And I've been teaching Ottoman history since my early youth in different continents, and constantly explaining that it is not slavery. You can call it domination, you can call it subordination, you can call it all different kinds, but it is not slavery, because slavery has a very definite explanation of a clear definition. So you quote the Brugiano Gheria, and Karkov quotes Hadjiski, of course, finding precedents who are speaking of this type of thing. And you're asking, is the neologism the problem, or the fact that there is not yet the word? But there was the word there, and he was using it. And it was the second edition of slavery. It's a Marxist word which nobody else wants to use nowadays, but they were using it. They were using it, and nowadays, of course, it has been criticized, rightly so. But so it's not that they were describing, they were looking for a word, they were finding words. So look, we are all humanists. We are working with everyday words. We are not, unfortunately, we are not scientists where we can coin words that nobody will understand and only we will understand each other, and that's fine. But we should be very explicit what we put in this word. And you're right that in some cases they are being used metaphorically, in some cases not. And I think I was, good enough to distinguish between the people who are using it in some sense or another. But the fact is that it has become so ubiquitous that it is, look, in the 1990s, everybody was speaking about resistance. Then came revolution. Then came post-colonialism. Now it's decolonization. I wonder how long.
Thank you. At this stage, I would like to pose maybe two questions right away to both of you, and both somehow relate to yesterday's discussion as well. The first question goes back to, I think what we agree on here is that the current attraction of the decolonial paradigm rests in its Eurocentrism, in its attempt to break European hierarchies. Now, if we look at Ukrainian perspectives, the proponents of it, decolonizing perspectives are usually the same ones who insist on Ukraine defending European universal values of human rights, wanting to be accepted as a dignified European nation, to be part of the European hegemony, so to speak, which boils down to attempting to or striving to join the European Union, which is not precisely breaking away from capitalist hegemony. So isn't this where this quest for a unifying paradigm and a universal metaphor sort of becomes shaky and opens an intrusion for what Anušović also yesterday said, for Russian propaganda to say, but we are the true proponents of breaking Western hegemony. The second question I would pose right away, so as to leave more space for discussion, is one might be at odds with what Yuri Androchovich, how he painted the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians, and in analytical terms, I heard many voices, and I would share them yesterday in saying this is highly problematic. I wouldn't agree, others would, but what I find quite convincing is the individual trajectory of discovering difference, as he mentioned, and insisting on this essential and essentializing, so to speak, this difference between himself as a Ukrainian and the Russian side, from which he emancipated himself. And is this insisting on difference, isn't that something which, beyond European hegemonies and capitalist world systems, something which quite neatly might dovetail with a decolonial perspective? So, two questions to both of you. Who wants to start? Maybe Manuela?
We did not get the questions before, so I have to think while speaking. It's known to have worked before. First, the proponents of what it means for Ukraine to embark on a decolonial path do not agree with each other. There's more than one path that's being suggested, and Mignolo was quoted yesterday with his newest take, which is basically de-Westernization and not decolonization. But this is an outlier, let's say, in a lot of debates. But basically, I think a lot of theorists from the decolonial perspective would agree that no decolonial project is possible from the level of a nation state or as a nation state. So going for any new type of suprastatal formation as a nation state is basically taking existing structures that have been shaped through centuries of colonialism and reifying them and giving them more rights. Obviously, it is partaking in an already very hierarchically structured capitalist system and taking a bigger piece of the pie that includes human rights. That is not decolonial. I don't know if that answers your question. Insisting on difference, I'm not sure I got to the gist of the question, but yes, insisting on difference does dovetail well with decolonial perspectives. It depends whether or not there's more attention being paid to imperial differences than, I'll say, just colonial differences. At a global level, there are more colonial differences than there are merely non-Western colonial differences that can be called imperial. But the imperial difference has been paid little to no attention in decolonial scholarship, and it is of interest to us here, and it has been kind of worked from a Eastern European and Central Asian perspective more, but it's actually at the level of theoretical production, one that is still very much under research, under theorized, under used. But if that wasn't your question, then restate it and I'll try to answer again.
Thank you. I was basically trying to say that maybe Andruchowicz didn't offer us a set of concepts to analyze the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians, but describing an intellectual trajectory, which, if we take it as such and take it as more typical for developments within Ukrainian society, we are discussing on a different level. We don't have to buy his description, but he offers us a key to understanding what is currently happening in Ukraine. Maria, maybe you can take your... We have 3 microphones here, actually.
I have my private.
Yeah. And so would you.
Do I switch it on? Is that? Yeah.
It's already on.
Okay. So essentially, we are speaking here different narratives in the same language. Yesterday was one narrative, today is a different narrative. And I have no problems actually with what Andruchowicz said. He was saying what he thought, and his insistence on difference, I would say only one thing. What Putin has achieved in doing is consolidating a nation in the making. And Andruchowicz was speaking about the pain of how this nation is being made. So it's about nationalism. This is what we do when we look at differences. Whether we like it or not is a different story. But we are here not to like or not. We are here to analyze. The liking or not is always with a glass of wine. But here we are to analyze what he said. And I analyze him as a plea of a nationalist who wants to create a nation. And it's a difficult task because the nation is so divided and so diverse.
Thank you. I've already seen a first question by Andreas Umland and now another 2. Maybe we'll start with collecting 2 by 2 and then we'll see how this goes on. Andreas Umland, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andreas Umland, Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. My question is slightly primitive because I have not read most of the literature that you cited, apart from Snyder, Plochy, and Wallerstein, and also perhaps cognitive interests, like perhaps also others here, are not so much driven now by intellectual fashions than by seeking shelter in a bomb shelter from a cruise missile, something like that. So my question would be, what does this mean? This discussion of these concepts mean for conceptualizing the Russo-Ukrainian war? Because I had already before what I've heard today the feeling that maybe we may be in a conceptual dead end with using these terms, imperialism and colonialism, for this war. Maybe one of the reasons that the so-called global South is not understanding this conflict is because it is actually not maybe so similar to the colonial experience. Because one could argue that the war is not so much and not only about Russian imperialism, but about Russian nationalism. It's about returning the mother of the Russian cities to to Russia as the perpetrators see it. It's not just about colonization, but about annexation. It's not just about subjugation of Ukrainians, but assimilation of Ukrainians. So one could argue it's genocidal in the fullest sense in the world of the word, because it not only denies the Ukrainian present and the Ukrainian future, it also denies the Ukrainian past. It's also, the argument is, in a way, a justification for the genocide. There isn't nobody to annihilate in the first place. It's an artificial product created by the West or Lenin or whoever. So maybe this terminology and these concepts of imperialism and colonization are actually not so applicable here. And that's one of the reasons that the conflict does not understand in Latin America, in Africa, and Asia.
Thank you, and I will take a second question there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mirko Krupa from the German Foreign Ministry. Thanks, first of all, for these very inspiring and thought-provoking interventions of both of you. I had really enjoyed that. I have an analytical and an operational question for you. Firstly, analytically, you mentioned the idea that decolonization maybe started in the Balkans in the early 18th century. It was a thought given here. I'm not an expert on the issue, but my understanding of nation formation as a source of this was liberalization and new elites forming around liberal ideas. So what would you think about the idea that actually decolonization started in the United States and the independence of the United States? That would be my analytical question for you. And operational, if we picture Berlin and the mayory of Berlin, the red brick building, there is in one of the conference and big halls for receptions, there's a picture of the Balkans conference that is showing Bismarck and all these imperial leaders dividing the Balkans among themselves. And we are celebrating this year 140 years of the second Berlin conference on the Congo, border limitations. And from a decolonization perspective, how would you view that picture hanging in Berlin, and how should we deal with that? And maybe a commentary. I would love to hear a 2.0 further analytics when you take China and Japanese imperial ambitions into your analytics. Thanks.
Thank you. I think the second question goes directly to you, Maria, and the first one to both of you.
Okay, so several questions. The second was just the first one on, just remind me, I'm blanking.
Whether this is a dead end for Ukraine. That was Andreas' question.
Well, look, the entire debate is clad in dichotomies. It's either, as you say, imperialism, colonialism, or it is democracy against autocracy. They stopped speaking that already. What is very interesting to me that neither yesterday nor today are we speaking about geopolitics. That to me is astounding. Why aren't we speaking about NATO? Why aren't we speaking about not only about Putin's mirages and idiotic things about whether Ukraine exists or not, or whether this is Matushka Russia and whatnot, but actually about security, right? Why aren't we speaking about that? That is also something that the global South is interested in. So, I mean, if we are going to speak about Ukraine, we should look at all the factors and all the standpoints with which we have to approach the situation. Now, just remind me of your very first question before the Berlin Congress. The United States. No, first of all, I've never said that decolonization starts in the Balkans. It's Timothy Snyder, and I'm very much against that. So I wrote, it's written. It's in Slavic Review. It's my students are showing it as a good polemic, right? I'm totally against that. Formally, the United States decolonized themselves. Yes, formally, yes. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that Benedict Anderson writes about the beginning of nationalism as decolonization in the Americas, including also the United States. Formally, one can speak of that. And formally, you can say that there is the hegemonic of course, notion of the English language, which is now reversed, of course. Now the Britain is the hegemonic, poodle of the United States, and so on. But the Berlin thing, in the case of the first Berlin Congress, 1978, you have a great power struggle, right? At a moment when Kleinstaaterei is considered to be the worst thing in the world, from everyone, not only from the elites, but also from Marx himself. He looks down upon these, dregs of humanity, as he calls them, who want to have their own nation. So nationalism was not fashionable at that moment. And you have geopolitics at this moment. I mean, I'm really quite amused when people are saying, oh, now we are in the 21st century, we shouldn't speak about geopolitics. Come on. I mean, all nations speak about geopolitics. All nations speak about their own interests, right? And the fact that you have a global South which can sympathize with Russia as an anti-Western hegemon is not surprising. I'm not saying that it's not very good Russian propaganda. It is. But it is not surprising that they buy it.
We could now have a controversial debate up here on whether in 1878 nationalism was fashionable in Europe, but that might lead us astray.
No. I said Kleinstaaterei. It was very fashionable as long as you have unifying nations, but not the ones that are creating small and economically unviable entities. Absolutely.
I'm not going to continue on this right up here because we're not having a debate on the Berlin Congress. Manuela?
Yeah. Just quickly, actually, it has already been said with regard to the fact that it's not surprising that the Global South sees Russia as anti-imperialist, which I think does not mean at the same time that the conflict does not have parallels with decolonization struggles in the Global South. Only the position of Russia with respect to a lot of, especially African countries, needs to be completely reinterpreted in the context of this war. And this is hard to do once Russia has been seen as an ally for such a long time, while the West was the enemy. But that only means that a lot of these perspectives are blind to the parallels between the struggles in Ukraine and in Africa and other parts of the Global South. Not that the parallels are not there. So maybe a nuance there. And I think to your question about what happens if we bring Japan and China in to understandings of the big picture, let's say, I would say we can't understand them without inter-imperiality. This was precisely the call of people like Laura Doyle, but also Shumei Xu and Françoise Lyonnais, when they said, let's look beyond just the Western colonial paradigm and understand what is happening in other parts of the world that did not have Western colonialism or did not have colonialism at all. And that's where the concept of inter-imperiality comes up in order to make sense of them as not a contending structure, but one that overlaps and sometimes vies with colonial structures. And I think it's very important to see that in the context of Japan and China up to this day, not just for past centuries.
No, but I totally agree. So I'm sorry that I missed also that. The only thing I would say when we hurl this huge, etiquettes like colonialism, imperialism, colonialism, genocide, I will probably make the mood dark here, but there is the elephant in the room, and it is Gaza.
The next two questions are Jan Arendt and Imo Rebicek. Jan Arendt, you were first.
I have a question for Maria Todorova, and it's related to your point that the colonization discourse has become a lingua franca that is used in and outside of science. So it's a discourse that scholars cannot fully control. They can say the concept of decolonization is being used inflatedly, but there might be other participants in the discourse who don't care and use it anyway. So the question would be, how should scholars relate to such debates over which they have limited control if they want to keep talking to a broader public?
Thank you. And Imo?
Thank you very much. This is just a brief historiographical observation tied to a question. I read a paper the other day, and the critique of the colonialism model in there raised some very familiar questions, particularly to historians of the Soviet Union. Questions like how to reconcile local agency with central rule, or how do these two relate? What's the social basis of mass violence? And did people in the periphery, the colonial periphery, so to say, actually internalize the colonial systems and the values, or did they just merely pretend and basically tried to advance their own cause in the system? So this oddly resembled and even mirrored questions I didn't, but many other people have been having since the 1950s when discussing the totalitarianism paradigm. So the parallels are striking, and I'm wondering what kind of lessons we can draw from that, because one could say, in a way, we've been there, and are we coming full circle in discussing state rule, so to say, or are we moving the empires closer to dictatorships, or is it the other way around?
Are we
moving the empires closer to dictatorships, or are doing it the other way around for the 20th century?
And there was a third question.
Östen Baller, Berlin School of Economics and Law. Sorry that I open a new page. When I talked to my Ukrainian friends and colleagues 5 years ago, I said Vladimir Putin is an aggressor and a terrorist, but he's not a fascist. But when I saw in the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the speech of Vladimir Putin in the big hall of the Kremlin, and wrote what RIA Novosti wrote then. And Putin said, there is no Ukrainian country, there's no Ukrainian speech, and nothing, yes? It does not exist. And if you compare this picture with the Hitler speech, 1938, at the Munich Feldherrnhalle, the gestures were identical. And from that, I think, what's going on at the moment in Ukraine, this is pure fascism.
So, several new aspects being brought in. Who would like to start? Maria?
Well, can I start with the last thing? You're absolutely right. I mean, I always thought that Putin was rational, but this speech was completely irrational. But this is cherry picking. Later on, he said certain other things. He does not want to invade NATO. He does not want to go to Europe. And there are several, you read the Michael Ignatieffs, you read the Anatol Lievins in the world, they're telling you different things. So there is a whole sub-profession in, destructuring Putin's speech. Several doctorates written about, to analyze Putin's speeches. And I have also difficulties with some of my colleagues who write about Trump, that he's a fascist. Of course, you have some fascisant, you have structural similarities. But to call very easily some a fascist, I think is needless, because it becomes a portable, it simply becomes an epithet, it becomes an offense. Just like the right, the Putinists, the Trumpists were calling every person on the left communism. And each time you say fascist, behind that you have the mustaches of Hitler. Each time you say communist, behind that, or socialist, you have the mustaches of Stalin. So I think we should stop hurling those epithets of fascism and communism. With the gentleman behind you, I totally agree with you. Just when I said that at one point we were speaking about resistance, after that we spoke about totalitarianism, it's gone. It's gone. The explanation of state socialism as only totalitarianism is gone. Now we are speaking of network analysis, of modernization, of different concepts. So what should we do? And here I come to this question. We should do really small empirical concrete analysis. We still should speak a universal language. We still should speak a universal language, but always mediated by the examples and by the positions. Now, how do we speak to people that we disagree with? It's impossible to reach the broad public. That's impossible. Politicians can read the broad public. The broad public is becoming more and more ignorant. It doesn't read. It chats. It wants very short sentences. We write with long sentences. This is impossible. At least between ourselves, I plead that we should be careful of what we employ. And hopefully, and also, by the way, I'm not for the cleansing of decolonialism. I think that some people, and Quijano and others, are using it very carefully, but it should be placed in their own context and not universalized as a new meta-narrative, as post-colonialism was.
I don't think any of the questions were addressed to me specifically, but just to piggyback on some of Maria's answers. I am actually of the opinion that we should be doing large-scale, long-term study of social change, not just the particulars. But this has always been the tension between history and sociology, and I actually hate to embody what my discipline stands for, but it seems that at this point I do. But I don't think that's a contradiction. I think that's a real possibility for dialogue, in long sentences, though. With the sequence of, let's say, concepts or even paradigms, again, I don't think that this is something that means leaving behind one concept to deal with another, because these are emphases. At some point, something stands kind of in the foreground, as modernization did for a very long time. And it wasn't so much that modernization was the catch-all term, it was that it was being imposed and funded, let's not forget that, by the United States government, so that it had become inflationary. So it was important to address it politically as well as analytically. So I would not compare that with the inflationary use of any other term that did not have that huge financial backing behind it. And some very prominent terminological debates, as the ones around the term post-colonial, have dealt with either what the post means. Is it the same as in post-socialism? Is it the same as in post-structuralism? And so on. And many answers were no. So when was the post-colonial? Is Europe post-colonial? Are European states that never have had colonies also post-colonial? Is, I think, a valid question, but one that does not derive from a political backing of the term as much as from the emotions it stirs for the ones that it touches deeply, because what it did start to say, at least in the beginning, was the periphery is post-colonial and the center is still untouched. And this, again, is a political question that I think needs to be addressed, and that in the context of Germany, before there was any serious reckoning with Germany's own colonial past, of course, the answer would have been, well, Germany's not post-colonial. How could we be post-colonial? We never had colonial. Well, it was just 35 years. It's really not important. So turning this into, yes, all of Europe is post-colonial because the world is post-colonial, it's the world after colonialism, is in a way, and I do need to bring back coloniality here, in a way reckoning with coloniality as a structure that impacted places in which the reality of colonialism was not there, but nevertheless the consequences that the century-long colonial rule brought with it also impacted those places.
Thank you. No further questions? Gemma Pölzgen and Florian Peters.
My name is Gemma Pölzgen, a journalist from Berlin, and dealing with the short sentences, my question would be how dangerous is actually this post-colonial narrative? Because in my view, a lot of even, especially younger journalists use this framework to explain nearly everything. And I think this is dangerous in that sense that it helps polarization in the society, and I would be interested in how do you see this? Is there a danger in this kind of discourse?
Yes, thank you very much. Florian Peters, Friedrich-Schiller-Universität, Jena. My question is rather a reflection and maybe not really directed to the right addressees on the podium, because I wonder in which kind a discussion on post-colonialism, decolonization, nationalism, imperial rule would look different or should look different if it is taking place in Germany than in the English-speaking world, because of course, and we are now speaking in German, in English, and in Germany, but in English, which is a certain positionality thing, isn't it? Because I think it's clear what I'm getting at, and of course I don't deny the colonial part also in German history, but nonetheless, the more, I would say, the more drastic and historically more destructive parts of German modern history, at least, have been intensively, have been connected to nationalism, national socialism, and not so much to colonial expansion overseas. So if we accept the paradigm of post-colonialism as a meta-narrative, isn't there a danger to underestimate the destructive force of nationalism, especially, and shouldn't we take this more into account if we are discussing here in Germany? I don't know whether you are the right ones to answer that, but I would like to share this reflection, actually.
Thank you. And maybe a final question by Valeska Bob-Filimonov.
Yeah, Valeska Bob-Filimonov from the Romanian Studies here in Jena. I was wondering just if we talked so much of inflation of certain words and context, and I was just wondering, do we have enough words to describe the societies, what we call about Eastern Europe? Because we always go back, as you said, Maria Todorova, we use fascism for Trump and for Putin, so we always use older concepts referring to historical periods that existed before, and of course we have this decolonization, but what exactly, do we have enough words in the other part? What happens now? Where are these societies? We have these post sometimes, post-socialism, does it still work or not? Or what else could be invented, or what else do we have? Thank you.
Thank you. 3 big questions, 10 minutes.
I see your pain and I share it, but it's a problem for the journalists and how they're being paid to write short things. I have yet to see independent journalism. I stopped reading the New York Times. I read, a little bit of dissent. The Guardian has become also propagandist. Or only online journalists are saying long and interesting things. So, there is auto-censorship and censorship in journalism, and they're and they're using. I'm not saying I'm talking about, let's say, the Anglo-Saxon media and every other media in general. But also the journalists are asked to produce a lot, what the French, as I said, call pisseurs de copie, right? They have to produce a lot. The question is, how do we distinguish between overinflated things? As I said, some of the scholars that are using these terms are using them carefully, and they need readers who read them carefully. There are very few of these readers, and they read them and they appreciate them. The public needs quick things, and therefore journalists are using the quick. So I'm pessimistic on this issue of how to reach that. With you, I agree. Positionality is clearly the most important thing. Although I would actually say I'm totally with you, and in the paper it's there. Some concepts are funded, others are not funded. Nowadays, globalism is funded everywhere. We have programs of global studies, world history, entanglement. All these things are funded. Decoloniality and postcoloniality are not funded. So they are subaltern. They are there, but they are still subaltern. Why is it funded? Well, look at geopolitics. Who is funding them? The big ones, right? So I mean, we have to be very careful to see what concepts are floating and who is behind them, who is promoting them, and how they are funded. I actually missed her.
How dangerous is the reference to the ubiquitous reference to post-colonialism or decoloniality? Was that your question?
Well, I mean, yeah. So, yeah. For the region, I mean, I think imperiality is a good word. I think peripherality is a word. Semi-periphery is a good word, and it has had a very good hegemony is a good word. Legacy, I'm sorry to promote myself, is a good word. No. Legacy, insofar as most of the other words, like totally, they pertain only to the contemporary period. And I'm a historian; I want to look back. So I like the notion of legacies and the palimpsest of legacies coming from antiquity through the Middle Ages and so on, and you can discern them, you can see them. So the decoloniality for me is interesting, the ones that are interesting, but they all speak about mostly the socialist and post-socialist period. Whenever they try to go back, they are most often mistaken.
Yes, how dangerous is the term post-colonialism? It's not. Not more dangerous than the overgeneralization, which I think is the danger with this word and with any other. So I totally agree with Maria. We do need careful readers and careful listeners, but it is possible in journalism, and it has been done in the past weeks where there have been attacks against post-colonial perspectives, to actually give the floor to people who do post-colonial research and help clarify in kind of daily newspapers or in publications that reach a wide audience, and explain in plain language, which is a problem that for a lot of academics, to actually boil it down to accessible language, but to explain first and foremost that there is no post-colonialism as a whole. there are so many differentiations. There are so many. It's not about who uses it correctly and who doesn't. It's not one unified school of thought. And if you add the decolonial perspective into it, it's even a very different theoretical genealogy, and it's all over the world. So you have to be here, again, specific about who you mean and how you employ the term. Of course, if it is overgeneralized and it's reduced to the way it's been presented, post-colonialism divides the world in victims and perpetrators, then this is, first of all, not post-colonialism, it's something else. But then, of course, it's dangerous as any kind of simplification. But we should be attentive to complexity here and to terminological specificity. We speak in English in Germany. Well, yes, we should be also international in Germany, and this is the language of internationalization. But with respect to post-colonialism, of course, you're right. There has been a debate for some time before post-colonial perspectives were admitted, so to say, as legitimate in Germany. And my colleague Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez has called this like a threefold rejection of post-colonial perspectives in Germany on three grounds. One, that it came from Anglo-Saxon contexts, so it had to do with English, it had to be expressed in English. Second, that it came from literature and from basically cultural studies more than the social sciences, so that for a long time in the German social sciences it was not considered something to be taken seriously because it was from a different discipline. And third, because the entire perspective and the problematique that it came with came from countries with genuine colonial pasts, which of course is in itself a refutal of the understanding that Germany had colonies and had a significant colonial past. So the fact that in the end it is possible to discuss, or it has been for the past, let's say, 15 years, to discuss post-colonial perspectives in Germany has to do with kind of watering down of these critiques and of understanding that we need a vocabulary to understand German realities also in German. And it's not possible to treat this as an import from Great Britain just because the British Empire was so big. But I don't think here that it means that if we emphasize colonialism in the German context, we understate or we kind of minimize the dangers of nationalism and other specifically German problems, so to say. And as Michael Rothberg has put it, multidirectional memory is possible, and it doesn't have to be a competition. It doesn't have to be, besides the fact that the two are entangled, and besides the fact that colonial history spilled over into a lot of Nazi ideology without claiming here the continuity thesis, I know. I'm just saying there are parallels that need to be taken into account that we will just not see if we don't address both. And that actually speaks also to Valeska's question, because it's, on the one hand, the search for specific terms for our region or for a region also comes with the danger of reifying that region as a need of specific terms, which actually ends up reifying the region, isolating it, and not looking at entanglements. Now, this is not to say we don't need specific terms, we do. But sometimes looking into the terminological apparatus of other contexts from other perspectives can be an inspiration. Now, the inspiration doesn't mean that it's a wholesale borrowing of other terms. It can just mean that, okay, I see something there, it needs to be modified for our region, or it can be or should be put in dialogue with already existing terms. And I think that's what helps us have a global view in which regions are included, rather than do area studies as we have been accustomed to do.
Thank you. To a certain extent, the question, and that would be my concluding comment on this question, the right vocabulary is not just a question of understanding what is going on, but it's also a question of how do we imagine possible future scenarios, outcomes, productive ones, and translate them into politics. This is a question that goes to the decolonial paradigm as much as to what does it help us to label things fascism if we can't draw any consequences from it. And maybe it helps us also to understand a certain reservation to think more in terms of geopolitics. It's now 11 sharp. The coffee is waiting for us. I want just to make a brief announcement that after the coffee break, we're going to split up into 3 parallel panels. The first one on imperial promises will take place here, and it will be translated from German into English. There will be a panel on identity that will take place in English in the neighboring seminar room 4. And there will be a panel on violence, Gewalt, which will take place in German in seminar room 8 or Hörsaal 8. I want to thank both of you and the entire audience for what I think was a very inspiring and great debate, not just on conceptual questions and how do they help us understand what's going on, but also and to analyze it, but also on helping to understand the debates about these concepts. And on these 2 levels, we had lots of food for thought, which can now sort of merge with the coffee. Thank you.